All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on blended finance and the privatization of international aid. I'm Emily Norgang, Senior Researcher with the Canadian Labour Congress, and will be moderating today's conversation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. This land has been inhabited by Indigenous people from the beginning, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of people who have been stewards of this land for thousands of years. Thank you all for joining us here in our webinar about blended finance. Before I get started, just a bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and you're welcome to watch it later on our Blended Finance website or to share it with your networks. We're also offering simultaneous interpretation today. So you should see a language option. It looks like a little globe at the bottom of your screen on the toolbar. And so here you can choose French interpretation. Throughout the webinar, we will be posting links in the chat, and this will take you to more resources, including our Blended Finance Project website. You'll also see that there's more details on accessing interpretation already there in the chat. So if you need help on how to use that interpretation, check out that link. And in the chat, we also welcome you to post anything you want. You can share your thoughts, your comments, ask questions, and feel free to use this to engage with other panelists or with participants joining today. We'll be turning to the chat at 2 points throughout the webinar and answering any of your questions. So yeah, keep them coming. This webinar is being organized by a group of unions, non-governmental organizations, and academics who are really concerned about the Canadian government's embrace of what is called blended finance. So I'll just begin by helping people understand what blended finance is. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, so the OECD, the blended finance is quote, the strategic use of development finance for the mobilization of additional finance towards sustainable development in developing countries. So this sounds pretty nice, it sounds pretty good, but what it really means is that public money, including foreign aid, is being used to leverage private sources of capital. And this really generates a number of adverse consequences that our speakers today are going to elaborate on. It's been blended finance, it's been promoted in Europe for over a decade now, but the Canadian government has also recently jumped on board in the name of promoting the Sustainable Development Goals. So the SDGs are an ambitious set of targets. They were developed by the United Nations and would promise to meet them by 2030. The Canadian government has taken a number of steps to promote this new agenda. In 2017, the government established the Development Finance Institute. It's also called FinDev Canada. And this is under the auspices of Export Development Canada. Its mandate is to support inclusive private sector growth through blended finance initiatives. Canada is also one of the main sponsors of the Convergence platform, and this calls itself the Global Network of Blended Finance, and it's headquartered in Toronto, Canada. And then alongside FinDev, we also have the federal government making significant changes to legislation. They've made significant changes to Canada's definition of ODA, of Official Development Assistance. They've introduced a new International Financial Assistance Act, and they've now committed $1.5 billion to facilitating innovative and blended financing approaches to ODA. So Canada's really jumped on board and very rapidly pushed this model through a number of new bodies and legislation. So this brings me to today's discussion. We're going to divide it into 2 parts. In the first part, our panelists are going to help us understand the concerns and dangers about blended finance. And then in the second part, we're going to discuss some of the alternatives. So I'm very glad to welcome 3 guests today who are going to help us understand what the experience has been in Europe, what the impact has been in the Global South and what the alternatives are. So first we'll be hearing from Maria Jose Romero. Maria Jose is from Eurodad, the European Network on Debt and Development, and is a leading voice on the problems with private forms of finance for development. She's joining us today from Brussels. We'll also hear from Jennifer Del Rosario Malonzo. Jennifer is the Executive Director of EBON International and is joining us today from the Philippines. And last, but certainly not least, we have Angela McEwen, Senior Economist with the Canadian Union of Public Employees. And Angela is joining us from Ottawa, Canada. And as the webinar goes on, we'll be posting more detailed biographies of each of our panelists in the chat, so you can check those out as we go. So welcome, Maria Jose, Jennifer, and Angela. It's great to have you here today. Let's start with Maria Jose. Maria Jose, based on the experience of European aid programs, can you help us to better understand what issues blended finance is supposedly trying to solve and what some of the problems have been with its use?
Thank you, Emily. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone. So thank you very much for the invitation and for the question. As you said, I will talk from the experience of the European and the global context, and blended finance is certainly not a new issue in Europe. It was initially used to subsidize loans to the public sector in developing countries, but it has been increasingly used to support private sector companies and to partner with private financiers. The current objective of blended finance is to subsidize private investment in development projects. At the level of the European Union, the European Commission started to channel blended finance resources or started to use ODA money in blended finance instruments through dedicated facilities in 2007, and since then it has increased substantially the use of blended finance. And the European Union has also promoted this approach at the global level, at the UN level, the United Nations level particularly. In 2017, the European Commission launched an external investment plan to increase the mobilization of private and public investment. And as I said, the amount of money has increased. But the evidence shows that many sectors, the main sectors attracting blended finance have been the banking and the infrastructure sector. Funds had been mobilized mostly for middle-income countries, and low-income countries and the least developed countries have attracted a very, very small share of all these. And more evidence is actually needed in relation to the positive impact of blended finance when it comes to development. Some of the main concerns with the blended finance agenda are the ones that I will summarize very briefly for you today. So the first one is that an agenda heavily focused on blended finance as the main instrument has shown that there is very limited private sector mobilization, right? The capacity of all these to actually deliver on the kind and the scale of investment that has been promoted, it has not materialized. Second, there is a lack of financial and development additionality. What I mean by that is that it's very important to understand whether the public money was truly essential for attracting the private capital. There is a risk that aid resources are being used to subsidize private companies to undertake investment that that the private companies would have made anyway. This is a very high risk. Number three is the lack of transparency and accountability, as there is not enough information in the public domain to make a detailed assessment of the impact or to hold governments and institutions to account. Number four is the limited domestic ownership. as developing country institutions and local actors are not represented when and where decisions are taken. This is an agenda mostly driven by donor governments. Number 5 is that there are various types of conflicting interest that might favor projects that privilege profits over development outcomes. And this includes the very visible risk of increasing tide aid, which means that the resources can only be used to buy goods and services from the donor country. And this is a very problematic agenda. And number 6, and with this I finish, is that there is a high opportunity cost of using development resources in this very particular way, as the resources used for blended finance cannot be channeled through other instruments that have proven track record of delivering development resources, such as budget support, for example. So with these 6 points, I try to summarize the concerns of what has been the European and the global experience with the use of blended finance. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria Jose. You always really have a way of explaining very complex issues in such a succinct and clear way. So thank you for that. A great way to get us started. So now let's hear from Jennifer Del Rosario Malonzo. Jennifer, let's dive a bit deeper into the impacts of blended finance on marginalized societies, including communities in the global South. A lot of the global discourse surrounding blended finance and other forms of privatization is often about risk mitigation for the private sector, and really little attention is given to the risks for impacted communities. So Jennifer, what are some of the risks of pursuing this agenda for communities around the world?
Thank you, Emily, and thanks to the Blended Finance Project for inviting me to this webinar. Maria Jose has outlined for us very clearly how blended finance is being promoted. But so for the South, as you have pointed out, there are so many risks that this agenda poses, especially since current narratives on blended finance and other forms of privatization have made the matter of development one of purely being a financing gap problem, rather than asking the hard political questions. These questions are important for public interest, such as whether peoples and their organizations are able to substantially shape the development processes. They have the capacity and space to participate in decision making, or even questions about adherence to and the promotion of human rights. These are all threatened to be really rendered secondary. So in prioritizing private finance and subsidizing and de-risking them, blended finance threatens to even worsen the inequalities that people especially in the global South have been facing for so long now. So this is from even more inaccessible social services to, of course, development aggression due to projects that are backed by international financial institutions or development finance institutions or co-finance infrastructure projects. So in short, this really risks to leave more people behind. So really the logic of privileging private interests, as MJ earlier outlined, and guaranteeing their profits and reducing their investment risk are harmful for people's welfare and access to social services. And this has all been further exposed by the pandemic, as impacts were worsened by privatized healthcare, for example, or privatized water services, inadequate public mass transport, and decent housing, especially in the global south. So the promotion of blended finance and other forms of privatization already follows a long history of expanding the corporate capture of development. I am speaking of, the direct privatization that has happened in the past, and then of course the PPPs or the public-private partnerships, and the private finance first approach, for example, promoted by the World Bank. So all these entrenched finance capital, and with so much bitter experiences for the people already, especially the poorest, and most marginalized. So definitely it poses huge risk to the ownership of development, because in many blending transactions, even the UN reports that governments are hardly involved, if at all, after the, already if the decision to invest is made. So if governments play a less significant role in decision-making on blended finance transactions, then how much more the people who are affected. So, as MJ earlier said, these blended finance deals really follow, the private interest that seek, of course, profits, more profitable returns. And yeah, so it actually goes to where business is less riskier. I would just like to also highlight that even as the UN Financing for Sustainable Development report admits, blending deals is not a panacea to fill the so-called investment gap. And they have also really had modest impact on poverty, and often the developmental impact is unknown, or as MJ earlier said, the additionality is not established. So the recently released 2021 Financing for Sustainable Development report already advises along the lines of minimizing the use of ODA in blended finance, and also and to ensure that it's just in line with national priorities. So this somewhat already moderates the long-running endorsement by donor countries, and of course other actors who are promoting privatization and blended finance, such as the World Bank. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was really helpful to better understanding, as you say, the corporate capture of development and how this private drive for profit is really negatively impacting people and communities, and especially the poorest and most marginalized. So thanks for that. So finally, let's bring in Angela McEwen of the Canadian Union for Public Employees. Angela, you've been engaged with the Financing for Development agenda for some time now, and have participated in meetings of the United Nations high-level panel that works on these issues. So from the perspective of public sector services and infrastructure, and of course of workers, what risks does the turn towards private sector development in general, blended finance, what risk does this pose for the Sustainable Development Agenda and for the goal of leaving no one behind?
Yeah, so I'm an economist, and I don't always agree with mainstream economists, but they have a saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And blended finance has kind of been sold as, no, there is. Here's our free lunch. Here's how we get that free lunch. There's all this money sitting out there that investors have to invest, and why don't they invest it in poor countries, and they'll get a return, and then the poor countries will be better off, and then us as rich countries don't have to feel bad that we're not meeting our development assistance targets that we've promised for years, and we're falling really, really farther and farther behind on. And so just from the beginning, this story falls apart. There's talk of impact investing, but when I was at the UN, there was a side meeting for investors, and the investors said that their clients actually aren't willing to accept a lower return. They want investments that have a green benefit. They want investments that can help reduce poverty, but they are not willing to accept like even, you know, a fraction of a percentage less in their return for that. And so the investors were saying that the firms that kind of set up these investments were saying, well, we've run out of projects. There aren't projects that have that return that we can set up for that our clients will be willing to invest in. And so the types of investments that do have those returns tend to be public infrastructure. So water, energy, ports, health. So some of the projects that they were trying to convince countries to set up a pipeline of projects to make it easier. So not only are you, you know, putting the first money in, you're saying, okay, we'll put in the first amount of money. So if there's a loss, you don't have to lose the first money, but I'm also going to do all the work to get the projects lined up and set up for you to invest in. So all you have to do is, you know, come down and write a check, and then you get your guaranteed return on the check. And the types of things that were in these pipelines are exactly what we were talking about. They were talking about privatized health clinics for women to come in and pay for maternal health. They were talking about energy projects, water projects, and basically taking, in some places, as has been mentioned before, it goes to middle income countries because, again, a middle income country is where you're going to get that return. And in the higher income areas of those middle income countries, where people can afford to pay a little bit for their water, where there might be some kind of revenue generation from building this infrastructure. And so all of this money is getting funneled into places which arguably aren't the highest need. So not only are we privatizing projects, we're putting public sector workers out of work, we're increasing the costs of using this infrastructure for the people who live there, and we're diverting funds from the places where we need it most if we want to actually meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And so in all of those ways, this story that we've been told to try to make ourselves feel better, I think is really what it is, and to try to have our cake and eat it too, where we can have corporations making profits and we can have governments not have to spend money to kind of match their rhetoric, and we can have development. Well, we can't have all of those things. They can't be win-win-win. There has to be local involvement. There has to be democratic involvement in how we're spending our overseas development assistance. And what tends to happen then on the ground, so there's huge delays in getting the money out because it can be incredibly complicated to negotiate these deals. And so it will take a year or two longer. So there have been gaps where money hasn't gone out the door for a couple of years because they're trying to negotiate these deals. And then there's a lack of transparency because often the financial organizations kind of don't want to give away their secrets. They don't want to let people know what a break they're getting on the interest rate or how much they're getting subsidized here, because that's actually part of how they make money. And so they're trying to keep as much of that secret as they possibly can, which harms transparency. And so all of that together just makes me incredibly skeptical that this can be an effective tool for development and to help us meet any of our Sustainable Development Goals.
Thanks, Angela. It's helpful to really, you know, as you say, better understand how this drive for the return on investment is directing what projects are being targeted, is leading to, you know, the privatization of public infrastructure, and really the importance of local and democratic involvement. I think that's key, and getting, making sure we have that transparency in these projects. So thank you for that. I just also like to remind everyone, for those who joined late, you're welcome to share any thoughts or comments in the chat. We'll be turning to the chat in a bit to answer some of those questions. I see some questions are coming in, but feel free to kind of keep sharing that chat or your comments in the chat there. So Maria-José, I want to dive a bit deeper into the agenda of the Global North, and specifically into the role of countries like Canada. Why are wealthy countries pursuing this agenda, and how do we serve to benefit from blended finance? I guess building a bit more on what Angela said, there's no free lunch, so why are we pursuing this agenda?
Thank you, Emily, and this is getting very, very interesting. So one possible explanation is that the driving factor behind blended finance lies in the capacity of this instrument to generate business opportunities for private companies and investors, mostly based in the Global North. The blended finance agenda emerged at the time when private investors were looking for stable and safe returns, and when aid budgets were under threat after the last global financial crisis that heavily hit northern countries. Civil society organizations from both North and South have raised concerns in relation to this, because blended finance might increase the risk of development cooperation becoming secondary to self-interest foreign policy objectives, and in that way diverting aid from poverty eradication, and for an agenda that is focused on leaving no one behind, which should be the case. In most of the cases, it is clear that an agenda focused on using aid to subsidize private investors will have citizens in a secondary place, and this is extremely worrying. And we are seeing the promotion of this agenda in shaping this particular way, and it has been very challenging to hold private sector companies to account. And there is an urgent need to increase the capacity of national governments to regulate the activities of private sector companies in the public interest. So that's why I see the answer to your question in these two senses, right? It's a way of creating business opportunities, and in a way, these business opportunities actually do not trickle down to benefits to people, and this is why this is so problematic. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria-José. That's really helpful. Now, Jennifer, I want you to build a bit on what Maria-José was saying. A major focus of your work and really your life's passion is fighting for equality, for human rights, and for social justice. Many of us are generally aware of the ways that privatization increases inequality and harms our society's most vulnerable. And we're aware of it here in Canada. Is the increasing involvement of private sector and international aid having similar impacts globally? And what does this mean for human rights and equality around the globe?
Yes, definitely. As I mentioned earlier, blended finance and the increasing involvement of the private sector in aid worsen the inequalities, the non-fulfillment of rights, or worse, the rights abuses that people have been facing, especially, in the Global South. So from even more inaccessible social services to development aggression, of course. So while big private sector is being prioritized, and given all the subsidies and protection from the government, civil society and people's movements who have been pointing out, the problems with the involvement of the private sector in development, and the whole corporate agenda in development, have increasingly faced repression criminalization, and other threats to prevent them from engaging in the development process. So policies such as these are implemented are really still being shaped by neoliberalism, which actually benefit the big corporations and the private investors. And these big corporations certainly do not operate with human rights concerns in their mind. So it's really concerning, very much worrying. And even today, in the midst of the pandemic, there is the claim that the private sector is even more important in our recovery because there is supposed to be a dearth of capital. And this whole narrative disregards, the role of neoliberal policy that has enabled, extensive capital flight and the many risks that the people are facing now. All the impacts of years of privatization, liberalization, and deregulation that has really created many problems for countries in the global south, and I suppose even in the global north.
Thanks. That's helpful to really better understand the impacts on human rights globally. Thank you. Let's turn back to Angela. We're currently facing one of the greatest challenges of our time, the climate crisis. Now, we all know that the role of private finance in climate solutions isn't straightforward, even here at home in Canada. And I imagine that's the case internationally. So what can you tell us about blended finance when it comes to our response to climate change or to the need for a just transition in green jobs?
Sure. So we have the Green Climate Fund that is capitalized partly by rich countries and that was operating partly in a blended finance way. And then there's regular blended finance that has been used, for example, in South Africa. The South African government set up something kind of like Canada's infrastructure bank, where they or FinDev, where they set up something to kind of make the financial instruments work and make the investment attractive for the private sector to come in and privatize the energy industry. And it was done under cover of green infrastructure. So they were leveraging private investment to build renewable energy, but it was taking over public sector, something that had been public sector and where there had been a lot of reasonably high wage jobs. And so blended finance was used to upgrade the infrastructure, which is of course good, and that's something that we want. But unfortunately, it was subsidized by the public. The profits go to the private sector, and a whole bunch of people were put out of work. And so when unions talk about the need to transition, we talk about the need to make sure that we're thinking about where those workers will go and what kind of jobs will they have. And if we're not directly able to create jobs in energy infrastructure for them, we should try to do it in other ways and invest in training. And that's why you would want to keep something like that energy infrastructure public. So if there is revenue to generate, then you can use that revenue to help retrain and replace the workers in other jobs. If it's kind of, we have to shut the coal plant down and you have to go work somewhere else, but at least there's some kind of support for those workers to transition. Otherwise, what you get is this deep resentment from the workers who are being put out of work and who are being affected by climate change. So we have that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, from the Climate Fund, we have the Global North telling people who are countries and leaders who are most affected by the impacts of climate change that they have to spend half their money on the preventing climate change and half the money on dealing with the effects. And so the finance minister for Jamaica was there, for example, and he said they got money and they had to put, renewable energy, they had to move to electric buses, but they're an island nation and they needed was money to upgrade their sewer system. But because we set the priorities in such a way that money wasn't available to them. So we're directing money in ways that we think are good without considering the actual requirements of the receiver nations.
Thanks, Angela. And it really kind of drives home the importance of public ownership of green and sustainable infrastructure for communities and workers, but also the importance of self-determination and the ability to have countries make those decisions for themselves. So now the part I've been looking forward to, let's do a lightning round. So the challenge to our three panelists, you each have no more than 1 minute to share 1 or 2 key lessons that we've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic and how these lessons can be applied to financing for development. So it's a challenge in 1 minute or less. So let's go in reverse order. We'll start with you, Angela.
Well, I think what we've seen in the pandemic is, well, one of the things that we've seen is that government procurement and trade rules can make it really expensive sometimes for governments to be flexible in responding. So there weren't enough ventilators or pieces for ventilators. And so the government of Italy had people who reverse engineered the piece and 3D printed it, but they were getting sued by the corporation because our system is at the point where we're prioritizing profit over everything, including being able to immediately save lives. That logic has gone so far. And I think that's really an example of how we need to reorient and put people first.
Great, and in 1 minute, that was perfect. Okay, over to you, Jennifer, you have 1 minute.
Well, for me, really, it's there is a need for ambition, greater ambition for systemic shifts today. So we cannot be, just going back to what was before. So we really need a reorientation for Southern economies. This means, getting away from the norms of neoliberalism. So shifting away from the dependency on foreign financing and foreign investment, which exacerbate extractivism, land grabbing, and really low wage labor, towards prioritizing their own strategic industrial policy and rural development, so that the internal dynamism of domestic economies and the means to realize people's rights, including the right to health, is really upheld.
Super, thanks. Okay, next over to you, Maria Jose. You have 1 minute.
Thank you. I will take the challenge. So first is to say that the COVID-19 crisis has had devastating social consequences and has shown us how vulnerable many countries and populations have been over the years. Decades of austerity policies and privatization strategies have undermined public health systems and undermined progress towards universal social protection. So this in a way, it's a very big thing that has been exposed. In terms of what this means, this calls for an urgent need to A, rethink the approach to development finance and to recenter development finance. B, rebalance the role of public and private sectors in our societies. And third, the need to strengthen public systems and put in place the right policies and tools to do that. Thank you.
Okay, great. You've all passed the lightning round challenge. That was really fantastic. It gives us a lot to think about and some real concrete steps to take. So before we turn to the second part of our discussion on alternatives, I'd like to just take a quick minute to look at what's being shared in the webinar's chat. It looks like there's been a lot of activity there. So Jean from Interpares has been closely following the discussion that's happening there in the chat. So Jean, can you share a bit of what we're hearing in the chat?
It has been very, very active. And I'm going to mention a few names, and please forgive me if I pronounce your name wrong. But I just will say that there are a couple of observations and questions first. On the subject of transparency, Gary Forster brings our attention to DFI, their DFI Transparency Initiative project. And there's a link in the chat. And he notes that they don't cover blended finance separately because it's no difference. There's no difference in transparency than the other DFI instruments. And they don't cover FinDev specifically, but they know that by looking at their data that they're no better in transparency than any other DFIs. It's a very interesting report, and I suggest folks who are interested could look at that. There's a few observations around the way that financing is done and how financing options of the blended finance sort can be made off the books. And so it doesn't actually show up as a liability, and an observation that maybe if in fact this bizarre accounting rule was changed, that there would be a lot fewer of these kinds of mechanisms set up. And perhaps some of the panelists might want to comment on that. A question as well about what proportion of Canada's ODA goes to blended finance. Brian Tomlinson did a marvelous interview for the Blended Finance Project, which is on our website. He estimated in that that it's about 1.6 billion late last year. But I'd suggest folks go to our website and take a look at those interviews. There's a lot of very good information there. There are a couple of questions as well. David Nemechek asks two questions. It seems that some blended finance goes to nonprofits, you said, and can't, in this case, the financing contribute to grassroots development in the respective countries. He also notes that many of the issues that are touched on, maybe they could just be fixed by rules and regulations that need to be stricter or better tailored to these dynamics. And wouldn't it be better to spend time recommending changes to these rules before rejecting blended finance as it now stands? There was also a question about the use of public procurement globally as an ideological site for the blended finance agenda, that actually these two things go together. A question about from Severin Sindizera, who wanted to highlight his concerns or her concerns about a lack of involvement of Indigenous peoples in the blended finance project, and that there's very little opportunity for Indigenous peoples to engage with the entire project itself, the structure of it, the goals and objectives, and Indigenous people are left to live in poverty. There are very few mechanisms to promote the initiative of Indigenous peoples in the business frameworks. So anybody who would like to respond to those things. Unfortunately, there's just so much, it's really hard to summarize, but that's the ones we have so far.
Thanks, Jean. That's a fantastic summary. And thanks to everyone, some really good questions in there for participants around transparency, bizarre accounting methods. Should we implement better rules rather than rejecting blended finance? How does it fit into public procurement? What should be the involvement of Indigenous people? Angela, Maria, Jose, and Jennifer, do any of you want to take a minute to respond to some of these comments or questions? Oh, go ahead, Maria, Jose.
Thank you. I am happy to respond to the question on regulations and how we make sure that this agenda actually serves development objectives, including with more transparency, accountability, and participation of a broad range of stakeholders at the global and particularly at the national level. I would here say that what is very problematic is the promotion of blended finance and the mainstream agenda that place the issue of blended finance center stage. It's true that this is not the only instrument that is being used, but it's the instrument that gets quite a lot of attention these days. And this is the quite problematic bit in the development agenda. We cannot focus the whole development agenda around how to subsidize private companies. This is what is quite problematic. We can, of course, include and push for more rules and regulations on how this is going to be done, but having the whole agenda around this, when this should be around serving development objectives and leaving no one behind, this is the problematic that we are exposing today and part of our work every day. Thank you.
Thanks. Did either of you, Angela or Jennifer, have any comments you wanted to, or responses to some of these questions?
Just to agree with the observation that indigenous peoples are really hardly involved in any decision making on projects such as blended finance. But I would also, in general, as I've mentioned earlier, that even governments are not at all at the decision making of these blending deals. They are hardly involved, and so much more the people who are affected. So it's not just indigenous peoples, but also rural folks, even the urban poor, for example, who will be affected by projects involving blending deals. So yeah, in general, really, the democratic deficits so-called in decisions are very worrisome.
Thanks. Go ahead, Angela.
Thanks. I would just like to say that I think it's a mismatch to use blended finance to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. I think there might be a role for blended finance if you're looking at sort of mid-scale companies that are having trouble getting finance from banks in their country, and you have set up some kind of development bank. Like Canada has a business development bank. A lot of countries have banks that help mid-sized companies get some financing, lower cost financing, to kind of help them scale up. And so if that's where we were targeting blended financing, I think we'd be having a completely different conversation. By targeting it at meeting our Sustainable Development Goals, there's not profit there, right? That's the only problem. So if these people need profit and they're trying to invest in areas where there is no profit to be had, there's going to be some squeezing going on, right? We're going to be exploiting workers. We're going to be privatizing stuff that should be public, which then leaves out the people who need that service because they can't afford to pay for it anymore. So I think it's just a mismatch. It's not that the whole idea is evil. It's just not suited to this purpose.
Great, yeah, really well put. So thanks for all those responses, and thank you to everyone for putting those questions and those comments into the chat. Keep them coming. We're going to try to turn back to the chat at the end of the webinar and answer more questions. So don't stop now. Keep the questions and comments coming. So now let's dive into part 2 of today's discussion on alternatives. So I guess to start with some hard numbers. Prior to the pandemic, the UN estimated that the financing gap, so AKA the funds still needed to achieve the SDGs, is 2.5 trillion US per year. So this originally estimated financing gap of 2.5 trillion has now grown to an estimated 4.2 trillion since the pandemic. And the unfortunate reality is that official development assistance, which in 2019 only totaled 153 billion worldwide, continues to fall far short of what is necessary to address growing global inequalities and the SDGs. Our speakers have already given us a comprehensive critique of the turn towards the private sector as a solution to this financing gap. So rather than taking this problematic blended finance route, there are a host of alternatives and a variety of scales of these alternatives that donor and recipient countries could start implementing here today. And recognizing this as a complex problem, these alternatives would move us in the right direction and are particularly urgent in the context of the pandemic. So let's start with you, Jennifer. The three of you have already laid out a comprehensive critique, but keeping in mind the pandemic's response, what are some of the alternatives that have been proposed by EBON International and your collaborators in the Global South?
All right. For EBON International, we have been pushing for a development finance and economic architecture that doesn't drain Southern resources. And of course, all of this should be founded on democracy with the participation of vibrant movements, civil society, both nationally and internationally, to promote accountability and people-centered development. That's what we have been pushing. And of course, there should also be a reality check that there is currently shrinking civic spaces in many Southern countries, especially amid the pandemic, that further serve as barriers to these people-centered processes and sustainable development. So amid these multiple crises that we are experiencing, we really require upholding development effectiveness as a minimum. We have earlier mentioned, democratic ownership. So this must be really a bedrock for development. So we have to ensure that the paths that we take towards development are rooted in people's needs and concerns. If such democratically determined priorities are to be honored, then in relation to the private sector, the donor actions should be also aligned to this. So alignment to this means building a new international consensus that addresses the different structural barriers that have been really laid bare by the multiple crises that we are experiencing. And more importantly, of course, accountability should be really strongly required of duty bearers. And governments have the task of creating conditions for inclusive partnerships in development and the regulation that is required for big private sector actors. Aside from this overall push for a different approach to development, of course, we have to address chronic indebtedness, especially of Southern countries, and the general reliance on very volatile flows of external financing. And so domestic resource mobilization must really be improved. So for example, at the country level, the usefulness of tax incentives that are given to multinational corporations, such as in special economic zones, must be reviewed. And of course, the promotion of progressive taxation, meaning taxing corporations and wealth more instead of the general public. And of course, curtailing, the illicit financial flows this should be the rules for domestic resource mobilization. And as you mentioned, the donor states have a historical responsibility, not just a commitment, on ODA and development effectiveness. And this responsibility has to be fulfilled to also help in reducing the current and future reliance on debt. So international public finance flows, including ODA, should really be commensurate in both quantity and quality to what are our urgent needs today and for the long-term shifts from these multiple crises that we are experiencing. So of course, as you've said, ODA is small and it seems to be really declining still. But we really push for the fulfillment of the long-standing aid target of 0.7% gross national income from developed countries. And of course, aid should be provided more as unconditional grants rather than loans to also reduce, indebtedness of countries. And lastly, on the role of aid, it really has to be protected. Its integrity protected as a financial flow that has a public mandate and address poverty and inequalities. So it should be safeguarded against, continuing to frame it as a catalyst for private finance. So the COVID-19 pandemic has really underlined the necessity and urgency for effective development cooperation. Yeah, so I think I would stop there.
That's great. A lot of really good suggestions there on, upholding democratic development, the importance of accountability, government conditions for private sector actors, domestic resource mobilization, progressive taxation, tackling illicit financial flows, the importance of increasing public finance flows like ODA. Really a lot to digest there. Thank you for that. And as you say, we've been critical of these trends for some time now, but it's really true that pandemic has intensified the need to take these steps. So thank you for that. Maria Jose, speaking to the global picture, what are some of the changes that donors, for example, development banks, could and should make to use public aid money more effectively?
Thank you for the question, Emily. I think that it's very important to get to the point of what should be done, right? What type of alternatives we have for all these. When it comes to aid and the question on of quantity and quality, I won't repeat what Jennifer said. Definitely we subscribe her points on quality and quantity. I would add a point on the modalities that should be prioritized. Thinking about alternatives, I think that the use of budget support, which is not something new for aid providers, it should be prioritized. And thinking about what else can be done, this is clearly something that has to be put front and center in the table. Budget support provided without economic policy conditions and in line with development effectiveness principles have the capacity to support national governments to strengthen their public systems. And I mentioned that as a priority before. When it comes to what else can be done, I could say that it's crucial that at the global level and that northern governments and multilateral development banks, also put additional efforts to tackle tax avoidance and evasion of multinational companies, and to do whatever possible to curb illicit financial flows. As all these practices undermine the capacity of national governments to fund social services in a high quality and in an equitable way. And finally, I could say that in this particular moment of very evident economic and social crisis, it's urgent, the point of having immediate cancellation of debt payments, which should be linked to a more comprehensive approach to debt crisis resolution under the auspices of the United Nations. This is a point that has to be strengthened, right, and stressed in this particular time, because it's not about debt suspension, or it's about debt cancellation. And it's about a comprehensive approach to debt crisis resolution. And all these as a package could definitely allow for an equitable and a resilient recovery in line with the SDGs and also with the Paris commitments. So these are my points for something that could be seen as an alternative agenda to what is being promoted these days. Thank you.
Thanks, and I like the way you put it. We have to be thinking about aid quantity and quality, and thanks for that, kind of some ideas around modalities that should be prioritized and the importance of public systems. It seems like we're seeing a theme come out around curbing these illicit financial flows, and I like the point about the immediate cancellation of debt payment. We've certainly seen renewed calls for this since the pandemic. So finally, Angela, what are some of the ways in which strong public services, public sector workers, and worker organizations can contribute to achieving development goals, both generally and in light of the COVID-19 recovery? And specifically, how does Canada and Canadian workers fit into this broader picture?
Right, so there's a lot there. So first of all, I'm from CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and I was involved in these discussions because we are actually an affiliate to Public Services International, which is an international union, umbrella union for public sector workers. And we're involved with them because we're involved in these fights at home. We're trying to keep water public here. We're seeing it get privatized through P3s, and we don't want to see Canada being part of exporting what we see as this broken model. We think that those P3s increase inequality in Canada, but they increase inequality globally as well. And so we really believe in these principles. And so we fight for them here, and we fight for them for our brothers and sisters that are in our unions that we work together with through Public Services International. Another piece of this is it's our tax money, and we think that we have, a democratic right to say how it's being spent. And if we're seeing it subsidizing already wealthy investors rather than going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals that the government has said they're committed to a feminist recovery that they've said they're committed to, that we think we want to speak up, and we want our government to hold our government to account, to behave in the way that they say that they want to. And also another thing is a lot of us have pension funds, and our pension funds are getting really huge. So through CPP, the Canada Pension Plan, that is going to get even bigger, because now that we've negotiated an expansion of it, we've negotiated it's pay as you go, which means all the money to pay it out has to go in right up front. So the amount of money that the Canada Pension Plan is going to be holding is getting huge. And they don't always invest it in ways that we would think were ethical or that are promoting this vision that we have. And so as members of a pension plan, whether it's your employer pension plan or the CPPIB, I think we have a responsibility to speak up and to get that transparency and find out where they're investing money and how they're behaving. The role of private enterprise is to make a profit. The role of pension funds is to make a profit. And so somebody mentioned regulations. Yes, we absolutely have to regulate, because if we will let them break the rules, they will break the rules to make a profit. So the problem is that we have not made appropriate rules. You can't count on these huge private sector actors to behave responsibly, because they have a fiduciary responsibility to their to their shareholders to make a profit. They have a legal responsibility to be making a profit. And so just like in Canada, when we paid out the wage subsidy and some of the people that got the wage subsidy kept paying out dividends, we didn't make the rules saying that they couldn't do that. So it's up to government to make sure that the rules of the game are fair. That's difficult to do in an international setting, but people have talked about trade rules. So we want to make sure that trade rules are fair and that our trade rules aren't forcing our partner nations into situations where they have to privatize or where they're having to pay huge amounts of money for medicines, like we're seeing right now with the vaccines, where we are refusing at the World Trade Organization, where we're refusing to allow generic vaccines to be made in South Africa and India, who have asked for the ability to produce more vaccines. And so people are dying because we're refusing to forego those profits for those huge pharmaceutical companies that have never had a more profitable year and that didn't spend most of the money to develop the vaccine. It was actually developed by publicly funded scientists. So we're in a situation where the priorities are just so skewed that we need to speak up and reorient our governments. And I think that we want to do that, whether that's how they behave domestically or how they're behaving abroad. In terms of the money, I think we need debt forgiveness. I think we need an international financial transactions tax that can help fund some of this. People have said, can't the private sector be responsible actors? We're not taxing them enough. No one is taxing them enough. And that's why they're able to create this amount of wealth. And so if we tax them, then we can use it to do the things, and we'll get a better return than if we're just counting on them to invest responsibly.
Thanks, Angela. I like how you put it that, you know, as trade unionists, we have to make sure what we're fighting for here in Canada, we should be fighting for our global brothers and sisters, and some really good points about our pension funds, what responsibility we have to make sure we're investing in ethical ways, to be shifting from free trade to fair trade. And you know, this point about the vaccines is a really immediate example of how these issues are playing out, and literally is life or death for people around the world. So thank you for drawing that connection. And thanks to all three of you for all these, you know, really informative and interesting solutions. I think we have a lot to chew on and a lot of ideas on how to move forward with these alternatives. So I'd like now to turn back to the webinar's chat for a minute. Jean, can you share a bit more about what we're hearing in the chat?
It's kind of hard to keep up with it. There's a lot of really excellent and very complex questions and observations being made. Thank you so much to the folks in the chat. We're going to try to collect these up and actually answer some of that on our website if we're not able to get to them today. But we are going to tax our panelists with a couple of tricky questions here. David O'Brien asks, he says that there have been reflections on how blended finance engages the private sector, but we're also seeing traditional nonprofit sector, NGOs and whatnot, positioning themselves as social enterprises to fit with this new ODA paradigm. And he asks about how you folks see blended finance changing the nature of the nonprofit sector as development actors. At the same time, there's another set of questions that are looking at the other side of this, wondering, well, is there not actually a big development finance gap? And isn't it necessary to try to mobilize some of this capital that's could be invested in development actions? Also a suggestion that NGOs can be incentivized to be more effective and more efficient by using such things as blended finance that makes them spend money wisely. Sorry, I'm paraphrasing that. There's that group of questions. There's also, again, going back to, okay, so if everybody knows and DFI staff know that actually blended finance is not raising the big bucks that were promised as the justification for actually doing this in the first place. So if everybody knows that, and we have a beautiful website that explains in excruciating detail just how that is, why do governments keep using ODA to capitalize the bilateral DFIs? One answer that was put out is you can, again, the accounting thing, if you spend money, make an aid expenditure, that shows as an outflow in the budget, whereas contributions to the DFI shows as an investment. So it doesn't increase the country's deficit. And so maybe that's a reason, but maybe there are others. So what's really driving this if it's not raising the big bucks, which it obviously isn't? Finally, there are a couple questions on how has blended finance worked in relation to, for instance, the SDG on decent work and wages? And has there been any focus on that within blended finance? Is there anything critical written about it? So I think there are a number of people looking at how blended finance has addressed specific SDG questions, and that's one of them that came up. I'll leave that. I think those are big questions to try to answer. Thank you again to the folks in the chat.
Yeah, certainly some really big and complex questions there. And again, yeah, thank you to everyone in the chat. I'm seeing just so much coming through. It's good to see everyone so engaged. So we'll put some of these questions over to the panelists around social enterprises, you know, how they fit into their kind of the nonprofit sector more generally, some more questions around the financing gap. Is blended finance really raising these funds? What's driving this? Questions around decent work and wages. Do any of our panelists want to jump in with some comments or responses here? Oh, go ahead, Angela.
Sure. I've participated in other panels talking about this, and I've talked to civil society organizations in Canada that have been trying to understand how this is going to work and figure out how they can make it work for them. And I know they've been doing fantastic work on the ground, and they've spent years where the government, like, there's been shifting priorities. There's not core program funding as much available anymore. It's more subject by subject, year by year. And so they're very, they need the money to keep doing the work that they're doing. And so they're very much trying to figure out how they can make this work so that they can keep doing the really important work that they're doing. And so I think this is just another case of where blended finance is not fit for purpose. What they need is core funding so that they're not spending all of their time, their staff time and resources figuring out how a financing arrangement works and how they can partner with the right people to make the funding work. They should be thinking about the project and what the needs of the people they're trying to serve are. And so I think we're just overcomplicating it. And part of the reason I think is government likes the narrative. It's politicians like the story that we're telling, because they're telling this story domestically just at the same time as they're telling it internationally. And so for the Canadians, at least at the UN, it was all about, oh, we can mobilize private finance. We can do this together. There's a way that we can be capitalists and have a kind face. And I think the one thing that we haven't really talked about is that we're doing this in a face of a growing investment from China in these countries. And so there's a real commitment to showing that capitalism can work, and that we're right ideologically. And so I feel like that's what's driving the politicians. They know it's not working. There seemed to be a sense among both the investors and the civil society organizations that this wasn't going to work, and eventually government would have to change course. But they seem really stuck on it. Yeah, and I think it's the narrative.
Really good point there about the narrative and what we're kind of pushing here in Canada, but also internationally. That makes a lot of sense. Maria Jose or Jennifer, do you have anything to add, or want to respond to any of the other questions that came through?
Maybe just on the development finance gap that has been raised again. I really think it's all about priorities. I mean, I say that it's a gap in quotation because, you know, there are many ways to increase public money. For example, what happened with liberalization, you know, there are less levies on traded goods, so that lessens the income generated by governments. Also, as I've mentioned earlier, taxing wealth and corporations would definitely you know, generate more income for public works and other important projects for development. So I guess in terms of policy, it really seems that what's being prioritized is the interest of you know, corporations, the commercial interest. So that's also what is driving this whole blended finance and turn to private sector. So if we want to address that so-called gap, there are many ways to address it, and not just giving away, you know, the responsibility of the state in providing social services or infrastructure for the welfare of people for corporations or investors to profit from.
Thanks, and that's a good kind of response to, again, that questioning that comes up about, do we really have to mobilize private capital, or are there better ways? And you provide some of those better ways. So thank you for that. Maria Jose, did you want to respond?
Yeah, thank you. I definitely want to share a reflection also on the basis of what Angela and Jennifer said recently, and it's that there might be a gap, right? We need finance, that's for sure. But assuming that the finance that we need must come from the private sector is a policy choice, it's a political choice, right? And this is where we are seeing all these efforts and all this rhetoric being mobilized around why and how much private money we need. We might need some private money for sure. The private sector has indeed a very important role to play, but that's why I mentioned before that there is a need in this precise moment to rethink about the role of the state and the role of the private sector, and to rebalance that in a way that serves the public interest. So for what we are going to mobilize private capital and who will be served, you know, who will be benefited from these efforts, and from what we are going to use ODA money, and in what way, for what purposes. I definitely think that a discussion along these terms is a bit more in line with development objectives. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria Jose. And thanks to all the panelists for those responses to the questions, and to everyone, all the participants who engaged so actively in the chat with those comments and questions. As Jean said, if we didn't get to your question today, we're going to try to answer more of them on our website. So stay tuned for that. But unfortunately, looking at the clock, I see that we're sadly nearing the end of our session. So I want to give each of our guests a few moments to share any final thoughts or comments that they have before we bring things to a close. And if, you know, in your final comments, it would be helpful if you could share a message to our audience here in Canada. So what should Canadian civil society unions, Canadian civil society groups and unions be doing? What's your ask for us in the North and for donor countries? Let's start with Maria Jose.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a very important question for us to close this session. As I mentioned before, I think that we are in a very crucial time. We need a comprehensive debate on the development model that is being promoted, included by the institutions heavily influenced by rich country governments. So Canada plays a very important role at the board of directors of the World Bank and in many other international forums. There is a high risk of getting back to austerity policies when the emergency is over, and of further incentivizing very, very problematic trends like privatization of essential services and an increase in debt service that is very problematic. So going to the point on CSOs, they have a very important role to play, particularly in Canada and in other rich countries. Globally, of course, and at the national level for sure, but coming to the point of rich countries, is key to expose the risks and the problems of blended finance and of any other practices that place the interest of private investors at the center. So there is a watchdog there, a role there to play, right? And it's also key to demand a high level of accountability. Transparency and accountability is key, and civil society have the very important role to demand that. And as was said before, when we talk about ODA, we are talking about taxpayers' money, and that should be used for the public good. So I would conclude that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Some good suggestions moving forward for, you know, us as Canada, a big role at the World Bank and other institutions, and some, you know, good comments for CSOs as well, and the important role that we play there as a watchdog. How about now let's go to Jennifer. Jennifer, do you have any final thoughts to share?
Yeah, just that while we continue to push for a different approach or for alternatives, unfortunately, we are still seeing business as usual, despite the calls from civil society and people's movements to break, you know, from the long-held and problematic assumptions that we've earlier mentioned. So really, there remains, of course, the need to push further, especially for strong people's movements, whether in the global north or the south, especially amid this post-COVID economic and recovery. So we need to be pushing stronger for a break from the old and make way for a greater ambition to address people's needs, especially as we face multiple crises, economic, health, and even developmental crises today. So, of course, we'd like to have more solidarity among peoples from the global north and the south. As you know, for example, in the Philippines, human rights defenders are experiencing various forms of violations, from extrajudicial killings to harassment, arrest. And so we are under fire for being, as you've said, a watchdog, or for voicing out concerns regarding problematic policies or development projects in our communities. So we'd like to appeal for more solidarity also, and to help us expose these rights violations in our country.
Thanks, Jennifer. Some good lessons for us to be, pushing further the importance of strong people's movements, but also really important reminder for many of us here in Canada about the real risks that human rights defenders face every day. They're risking their lives, and the importance for us to stand in solidarity and to continue doing what we can to fight for people and their ability to continue to defend human rights around the globe. So thank you for that. Angela, do you have any final comments?
Yes, thank you. I would like to strongly support what both Maria and Jennifer said. And then there's just one solution that I didn't get to that I think would make a big difference, and that's public banking. So I think if we can, public banks can sell bonds at a certain rate to investors that would guarantee them, say, a 3% return or something like that, and then use that money to invest more locally. So one example that was given, it's sort of like scaling up microfinance, right? So if there are goat farmers in a certain region that need more money to scale up their operations, this could be the type of thing that the public bank would actually be able to invest in locally, understanding what the needs of the local area are. And the investors, the global investors, would be holding the bonds for a guaranteed return. So that would actually provide them the safe long-term investment that they're looking for, but just probably at a lower rate than they're trying to negotiate right now. And I think that that's where we need to go, both in Canada and internationally. So Susan has put in the chat, there's a fantastic book that I haven't been able to work my way through yet, but I think that's going to be a big part of the answer.
Yeah, really good point on the importance of public banking, and I'll have to check out that book. Thanks for sharing that in the chat, Susan. So Maria, Jose, Jennifer, and Angela, an enormous thank you for sharing your time with us today. You've all given us a lot to think about, so thank you so much. I want to also let everyone joining us today as participants know that we're going to be updating our website with new interviews from Canadian and global experts. So this will include interviews with the Municipal Services Project, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, Public Services International, and many others. So check out the site as we'll be updating it in the coming weeks and months. We're also continuing to engage within the Development Action Committee, civil society organization, so a mouthful there, the DAC-CSO working group around private sector engagement for development. And we're looking forward to the publication of the DAC ODA stats next month. We're also going to be paying close attention to the upcoming Forum on Financing for Development that's being held April 12th to 15th in New York. So keep an eye out for these and other releases. And as a reminder, the recording of today's webinar will be posted on our website. So if you haven't already, you can check out this website to see the webinar, to see updates on these upcoming events and important new events happening in this area. So check that out. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Stay safe, everyone, and thank you all for joining us.